Well, that was great. I think we owe Suzanne and Sandy another round of applause for getting us going on a Friday morning, so thank you. That was fantastic. And so I have a few people I want to thank, but are they all here? I'm going to wait. I want them to be here. So we'll go into the first panel. But first, one quick note is our Climate X team has been doing a great job as our digital partner in the summit. And they have a request to make, which is they want everybody to think about and answer to the question, what is your #1 regional priority? And there's two ways you can give them your answer. One is, here's Rajesh and Kurt from Climate X. So they'll be around and they can actually get audio of you with your answer if you'd like, or you can go to climatex.mit.edu where they have a web form. You can give them your answer there. So we'd love to hear what everyone thinks about that. So now for our first panel, moderating for us today, Janelle Knox-Hayes, Associate Professor of Economic Geography and Planning and co-head of the Environmental Policy and Planning Group in MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. So Janelle, welcome, and I think the whole panel should come on up.
Yeah, so I'll sit here and after I introduce everyone. Excellent. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here so early on a Friday morning. So in June of this year, as we all know, President Trump announced his decision to withdraw the United States from the Paris Accord, which has created a great deal of concern about what this means for the role of the United States moving forward. However, as you are all aware, there's a long history of states and regions, such as the Northeastern governors and Eastern Canadian premiers, of signing subnational climate agreements. And so this panel will explore the past, present, and future efforts by states and provinces to work together to develop policy frameworks for climate action. We have an outstanding panel with us today, and I know you have their bios in the program and online, so I will just briefly introduce your left, Rodrigo Taveras is the founder and president of Granito Group, a global holding company that advances the impact economy through innovative approaches to investment banking. To his left is Angel Su. She is the director of the Yale Data-Driven Environmental Solutions Group. She's also an assistant professor with Yale and US College, and she teaches at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. To her left is Chris Skoglund. He's the Climate and Energy Program Manager and Air Resources Division of the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. And last, but certainly not least, is Stacy Vandeveer. He is the program professor and PhD program director of the Global Governance and Human Security at the McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at UMass Boston. And so to kick off, what I would like the panelists to please do, we have a range of expertise represented here, is to tell the audience what is most important for us to know about subnational climate action. We can start with you, Rodrigo.
Well, I can give you 3 different versions. I have 3 different hats. Hat number 1 is an investment banker. I'm the president of an economic group devoted to transforming the global economy into an impact economy. We do that through investment banking, through consulting, and through research as well from Europe and the United States and Latin America. That's version number 1. Version number 2, I'm the former head of foreign affairs of the state government of São Paulo in Brazil. The state of São Paulo is a top 20 economy, the world's 18th largest economy. And for 4 years, I was leading the international efforts of the state government of São Paulo. I'm also a scholar. I work at Harvard, Columbia, and Berkeley on a set of different issues, also on city diplomacy. And the last book that I written was when I was just a kilometer away from here at Harvard, doing work on paradiplomacy. What is paradiplomacy? It's the international relations of subnational identities. They could be regions, could be states, could be cities. When they go out, when they sign international agreements, when they organize trade missions, when they have embassies or representations abroad. All that is called para-diplomacy. So I'll say two things. Number one, to answer your question. Number one is subnational identities going abroad, signing international agreements, being worried about climate change. It's not new. It's a hot topic now. We have been discussing that very intensively over the last 2, 3, or 4 years, but that is not new. I'll give you some ideas of how old this discussion is. The first international agreement signed by a subnational government, it was not 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, it was in 1907. Japan signed an international agreement with the state of São Paulo. The reason why in São Paulo we have the largest Japanese community outside Japan, it's because the two states signed a migration agreement over 100 years ago. A second good indicator is that the first state to have a representative abroad, let's call it an ambassador for the sake of making the conversation easier, was 1857. The state of Australia, Victoria, the state of Australia, it had an ambassador in England. The first State Department of subnational level is from Quebec, 1967. The first international organization that brought together subnational entities, it's from 1913. So the question is not new. What is new is the surge of paradiplomatic activities over the last 5 years, and in a world where 55% of the population live in cities, whereby 2050, around 66% of the population will live in cities, where 75% of the global GDP comes from cities, then a discussion on foreign affairs at the city level, it's becoming more prominent. Specifically on climate change, cities account for 2/3 of the world's energy consumption. They generate over 70% of CO2 emissions. 90% of the urban areas are coastal, so obviously there is an issue with climate change and flooding. But again, even on climate change, on the intersection between climate change and cities, the discussion is not new. The first time a discussion on climate change was held by cities, as far as we know, dates back to 1992, the Rio Summit. And then it was underlined again in 2002, the Her Summit. And then it became prominent in 2012, Rio +20 Summit, which I had the chance to participate in. Here in New England, obviously you have the New England governors, the Eastern Canadian premiers. There is a regional climate plan since 2011. And I guarantee you now, and I'll just conclude with that by now, we have around 150, 70 international organizations, /arrangements, /networks, /associations, /coalitions that bring together subnational governments. Out of those 150, about 1/3 of them discuss climate change. So R20, C40, ICLEI, UCLG, so on and so forth, they do discuss climate change, and they have been discussing climate change for at least 5 years. Those more prominent organizations. So the discussion is not new. We are hitting a point, a critical point right now, where we are no longer discussing the viability or the feasibility or the interest of subnational governments on climate change. Hitting the critical point right now is on the challenges ahead. And I can just address that later on. There's a lot of work to be done by cities and by states on climate change. We are doing a lot, not necessarily performing well, and that's a discussion that we should be having today.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Angel?
Thanks, Janelle. So there are two key points that I want to make. First is the opportunity that we're currently facing with respect to subnational engagement on a global scale. And then the second, I want to talk about data, because as the director of a data group at Yale, I feel like I'm compelled to talk about data. So the first is respect to the opportunity. So this year and moving into 2018 is going to be a key moment within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement itself. So national governments are going to be asked to revise their Paris pledges that they submitted in 2015 and to increase the ambition of those efforts. So when initial analysis was conducted of what countries had pledged for the Paris Agreement, what we found is that the world is on track to a 3-degree warming scenario by 2100. So we're way off track of that 2-degree, and now Paris, this 1.5-degree target to contain global temperature rise to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change. And so in order to secure the Paris Agreement, subnational entities were absolutely critical to demonstrating what the UN called Pillar 4, the need to secure participation from all levels of government and other stakeholders like businesses and investors, for example, and also civil society. And so it's a key moment to continue to demonstrate the commitment of subnational actors in order to demonstrate to national governments additional effort and ambition that they can leverage to increase the content of their Paris pledges. So it's a really key moment. And I would just also want to mention that Governor Jerry Brown of California, in order to, again, secure the commitment and the participation of subnational governments, has offered to host a summit next September 12th and 14th in San Francisco, that will be called this Global Climate Action Summit, in order to bring together CEOs and mayors and governors from all over the world. So I'm hoping that we have regional representation from the northeastern region as well at the summit. And so it's a key moment. And so right now I think we have to strike while the iron is hot. And secondly, to actually capitalize, I think, on all these various subnational efforts that are taking place, we have to now move from just the pledging and the political demonstration phase to actually more concrete information and data about what these different actors are doing. So Mike Bloomberg yesterday at his talk discussed the America's Pledge movement, and also We Are Still In, which incorporates now around 2,000 mayors, governors, and also businesses and universities to commit to the goals of the Paris Agreement, which I think is great. I mean, particularly in the early June moment when President Trump declared his intention to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement, there was a lot of concern about what that actually meant and whether or not we would be able to still deliver on the US's initial Paris Pledge. And so having that influx, I mean, I think what Mike Bloomberg said was absolutely right. I mean, I think he encouraged this counter movement and this wave of support from all these bottom-up actors. But that only gets us so far, right? So we know that these different actors have committed to support the Paris Agreement, but when we actually look at what that means, there's a lot of I think, still opacity and not enough information and transparency as to what these cities and regions are actually doing, and also these businesses. So Rodrigo, you mentioned these metrics. Cities represent something like 75% of global GDP. I've heard numbers as high as 85%. And you also mentioned that cities are responsible for 66% or 2/3 of global energy consumption. I've seen that number as high as 90%. And part of the reason is because there isn't a lot of transparency in terms of baseline emissions, inventories. When cities and CEOs take on climate targets, what baselines are they using? What do those targets actually mean? What metrics are they using to benchmark their performance? That information right now is very hazy, and there's not a clear mechanism or way for these various actors to share that information. And so what my research group is doing is we're actually trying to collect all that data, applying big data analytics and techniques to collect whatever information we can, develop proxies so that we can provide a clear aggregate picture to both the summit that Governor Brown is hosting, and also in the context of the UN, what actually national governments can expect and what additional effort they can leverage in order to support their increased Paris pledges. So I would say those are the two key points. First is it's a prime time to become engaged in this process, and secondly, now we need to have more information and details.
Excellent. Thank you, Angel. Chris?
All right. Thank you. First, I wanted to say thank you so much for Tom Kiley for putting this together. This has been a fantastic opportunity to hear other speakers yesterday, but also to get to meet some email addresses and some voices that I've been hearing over the phone for the past 3 years while I've been working in support of the NEG CP climate planning process. But I do want to take a moment and note that with a background in cell biology and an 8-year effort to get a degree in watershed management and then 23 jobs prior to starting at New Hampshire DES, I am uniquely qualified to talk about subnational diplomacy. But actually, the start of my role with DES or New Hampshire DES, has everything to do with the NEGCP and the efforts that have been going on prior just the past few years. In 2001, the NEGCP adopted the first intergovernmental climate plan. It was an agreement, not a treaty, not a the compact. But it was the first intergovernmental agreement that actually predated Kyoto Protocol because it didn't come into full force for another couple years. But with that, the states began to each develop their own independent climate plans, as well as the provinces. PEI and Newfoundland actually adopted the goals within that plan, and it's now in their laws. The plans that were developed by the individual states informed the Global Warming Solutions Act of Massachusetts and Connecticut. But because of the non-governmental bodies, the nonprofits that were tracking the efforts to implement this, I actually got my job because New Hampshire kept getting rated with an F because we didn't have a plan. And so they hired someone who had no experience organizing, and from that point on, I have a history of making stone soup. But beginning in 2015, we had a resolution in place. The resolution had asked for the NEGCP staff to come back with a goal, building on the goals that were in that 2001 plan, and we adopted right before, and probably a little bit because of the Paris Agreement that was coming up, a new target. We call it a progress marker, and it's very specifically called a progress marker and not a goal, because PEI and Newfoundland have adopted in their rules or in their laws the NEGCP goals. And if we were to create our own goal, we would create a bit of a conflict with the laws of their province. But we created a new progress marker, and it was to point the region to where we needed to be to stay on track to get to our 2050 target, because we realized that we had already achieved our 2010 target. We were on track to achieve our 2020 target, but through analysis of the energy in the region, we were not on track to achieve that 2030 target. So we spent over a year looking at what are the individual targets of each of the different jurisdictions, where are we projected to go, and where do we need to be if we are to support that 2-degree centigrade limit. And so we set a target of 35 to 45% below 1990 levels. The range was to reflect the fact that not every state, not every province has the same opportunities. But once that went into a new resolution, Resolution 39-1, we were instructed to come back with a list of goals, strategies, and measures that we could use to achieve that. And over a 2-year process, we began to look at the 2001 plan. We looked at all of the different plans within the region and began to reflect on where are the regional opportunities that we have to advance climate within the region, noting that each state, each province is going to have its own particular pathway, and that if we work regionally, we need to find where are the leverage points. So we came up with a plan that was just adopted by the governors and premiers this past August, continuing to kind of send a message, though not necessarily in line with America's pledge, that this region, which actually has the combined economy somewhere in the range of the 13th largest in the world. In 2014, that was just behind Australia and just ahead of South Korea, that we stand committed to achieving our 2050 targets. But now going forward, we're going to begin a process of saying, how do we implement that? And this comes at a time when many of the states have actually gone from past the point of planning and have begun to implement grid modernization efforts. And the key is, how do we make sure that we're coordinating all of these efforts within the states? But we also need to be making sure we're not duplicating efforts. A lot of things have popped up since 2001. TCI is one. Vicky Arroyo was here, and she's been instrumental to making sure that the states are moving forward on their transportation targets. But there are other groups that we need to make sure that we're not duplicating, and I think that's part of the effort going forward, as the states and provinces need to be looking out who's already doing these things so we're not duplicating them. And I just sat down and I'd never heard of the CGA before, and I would be interested to hear what they're doing and what their perspective is. So I think going forward, we actually need to be looking, what are the individual groups? I think you mentioned hundreds. We need to make sure we're not creating new work, because a lot of our staff, because we duplicate, we're not like CARB in California, which has a huge staff. We have 11 different departments that we're coordinating, so our staff are spread in many different areas in many different ways. We have to use our resources much more carefully and judiciously. And so we need to be looking, where can we kind of make stone soup? Who can do this, and continue to kind of advance our regional progress.
Thank you, Chris. Stacy?
Thanks. So it's great to be here. Thank you so much, Tom and the LIC for pulling us all together. I'll just talk a little bit about subnational action generally. I was a political scientist before I moved to an interdisciplinary policy school. I love interdisciplinary policy school, but my political science training comes out every once in a while. And so I thought a couple of things about sort of, in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, some of us did some early research from a social science perspective on all of this subnational cooperation. What are these cities even doing when they go to global summits, right? How is it that the states and the provinces, is it on?
Cool. So I haven't completely killed the technology. All right. Thinking about what these cities and states are doing. And I think a couple of things from that early research that have really applied much. And one of them, Chris is an example, is that actually mayors and governors call a lot of press conferences, they stand up, they sign a lot of documents, they take a lot of pictures, but it is the civil servants, the civil servant experts across city and state bureaucracy who do almost all of the cooperating, they write almost all of the memos, they convene almost all of the committees. So when we talk about the importance of a network organization and sort of a networks and the interpersonal trust you build, I think be mindful as we move forward that that is where the longer-term interpersonal trust gets built, and that's where the action takes place. Some of my favorite stories from that early research were civil servants in the States often saying, well, one of the things we always did was we'd call each other and say, how did you get your governor to agree to that? And then we'd trade slides, and we'd trade pictures, and we'd trade stories, right? And so actually they were leading, but that's not who gets credit for all the leading at the press conference. And I think this is important when we think about with whom we are building long-term institutional cooperation. So when you say we want to institutionalize regional cooperation, it's awesome that the governors are on board and they have to be on board. But it is the civil servants and the fact that some of these civil servants and some of the analysts and some of the environmental and energy activists move in and out of each other's circles. They know each other. Some of them move in from the nonprofit sector into the governance and back and forth. And this I think is a critical thing to understand about how it is this regionalized networking gets done. So you asked a couple of things about what to say that's good about it, or a couple of main messages. I think that everybody agrees that one of the things that's amazing about subnational action is that it's inducing experimentation, right? So American advocates of American federalism always call the states the great laboratories of democracy. That, if you watch the news, you will see that that might be slightly exaggerated. There are downsides as well, but you see this experimentation all over the place in cities and towns. And you get leadership in experimentation. But I think, echoing some of the comments of my fellow panelists, we have to remember what the limits are. And both at the global scale and here at the region, cities and states are not a substitute for real national action. Most decision-making authority rests in national governments. So if cities and states are leading, they need to be leading someplace. And one of the great things about New England and the ECG, the New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers, and also Reggie, is that even in the earliest statements of those climate actions in the early 2000s and then later when Reggie was launched, they said in writing and on the website, right, this matters only if it goes someplace, right? We need to do this because our federal governments are not, right? And I think actually this is another example of being able to push things forward. A couple of other points. One of the things you also see, though, in kind of studying this subnational action is one of its other limits is that the wealthiest and the high-profile subnational units are the ones driving the entire agenda. And they are really well networked with each other, and they are actually pretty badly networked with others. So the kind of classic C40 Boston, New York, London, Paris, Shanghai, Delhi, they all know their counterparts. In Boston and Cambridge, they all know their counterparts on each side of this extremely wide river that many of them won't cross, by the way. But they know their counterparts, but actually I live in Malden, which is only 3 small miles from here. The population of Massachusetts is 6 million people. Less than 1 million of them, a little less than 800,000 of them live in Boston and Cambridge. And Boston and Cambridge are amazing leaders, but it is shocking how little diffusion happens from Boston and Cambridge to the rest of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, right? We'd actually have really bad institutional connections for that. And the state is sometimes in the business of helping those connections, but often not. And the same is true at the global level. Boston and New York, everybody who does all of this work knows their counterparts in Boston and New York. They drink beer together, they go to conferences together, they trade slides and data, right? They know each other way better than they know most of the other folks around them, and that's true at the global scale as well. And that's partly because of wealth. It's also institutional capacity, the kind of modeling that Boston get to do with Climate Ready Boston. Malden will never do that. Cambridge can do it. After Boston and Cambridge do their amazing modeling, there won't be much more in the Commonwealth, right? We'll all be guessing what our situation is by what Boston and Cambridge did, but it'll be a guess. So unless the state of Massachusetts or others kind of step forward to flesh out those networks and make sure that networks aren't just connections between richer and more capable nodes, but with everybody else, then we have a challenge. The last thing I'll say about regionalization and regional cooperation is I think there is presently a push on, and the New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers made a nice advance this year by finally talking a little bit more about adaptation. But really, we are very behind in New England thinking about adaptation. And there are a lot of people who are writing good reports. I've been on some of them, I hope, that they were good. And many of you here too. But actually, most of the leadership on adaptation, most of the innovative stuff is not yet happening in this region. And so I think we do have to say there are leaders elsewhere in the country, there are leaders on the other side of the Atlantic, and we got to figure out how to get ourselves better connected to those leadership experiments so that they can be rejiggered and learned from and reapplied in our region. And we need our regional institutions to be pushing a little harder for that, and I think it's a great next step for the future.
Great, thank you, Stacy. So Rodrigo, I want to follow up on these points a bit further with you and ask, how do we understand this moment? So as you've suggested, subnational climate agreements aren't new, but as Angel also pointed out, they're growing in prevalence. So how do we understand what this means in terms of other international agreements, like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change? Can subnational agreements supplant that? And then for the other panelists, Angel, I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about, does this add up? How do we account for, how do we understand the commitments made by subnational actors? And how do we tally those? And then for Chris, it sounds like a lot of the challenges have been about the implementation or the collaboration between regions. So if you could tell us about your practical experiences working with that and how some of these subnational agreements can improve standard setting and improve the sort of consistency of what different actors within the region are trying to accomplish. And then finally for Stacy, just to follow up on this point on adaptation, if you could tell us a bit more about that and what can be done to improve adaptation through subnational agreements.
So to answer your point, the very first message that I conveyed to you was the international engagement of cities and states is not a new phenomenon. It's a very old phenomenon. It's a century-old phenomenon. Over the last 5 or 10 years, yes, it's right. Cities and states, over 1 million inhabitants all over the world, could be Africa, it could be Asia, Europe, United States, Latin America, they engage with the world. Yes, it's right. If you see France, for example, French provinces, they have over 14,000 international cooperation programs. If you look at the United States, 40 US states, they are running 250 trade offices abroad. The state of São Paulo has diplomatic relations with 150 countries. So all that is true. But we have to take a step forward now, and we have to start canvassing all these cacophony and noise and pollution and experimentalism of thousands and thousands and thousands of international engagements by cities and states, and we have to professionalize those activities, and we have to streamline them. So when I left office in 2014, I came to Harvard. The mission at Harvard was to do exactly that. So we surveyed around 250 international policies of cities and states. We looked at them, and we created a roadmap for mayors and governors. The book is here. If you buy it, I get 10%, which is good. It was published in 2016. It's an Oxford University Press book on cities and states as global players. It's a roadmap for cities and for scholars as well on the whole issue of para-diplomacy. So where are we right now in terms of looking ahead? What are our options? Number one, there is lack of leadership at the subnational level. When you look at countries, it's fairly easy to be able to demarcate the criteria that set some of the countries apart in terms of leadership. There are technical and rational reasons why the United States is a great power, Mexico is not, why China is, Mongolia is not. All those things are based on fairly rational criteria, hardcore criteria, soft power criteria, but those criteria exist. And naturally, out of those criteria emerge leadership. At the subnational level does not really exist. So you have 1, 2, or 3 leaders that come up every now and then. They organize summits, they make pledges, and they, in a way, they incorporate subnational leadership. But that leadership is diffuse, and there's a lot of overlap as well, and there's a lot of neglect at the very same time. So I was at the core of subnational diplomacy for 4 years, engaging with mayors and governors all over the world. And I can guarantee you that there is lack of drive, lack of governance, and poor performance as well at the leadership level. So we need people, we need governors, we need mayors to take this agenda forward. Probably the only leader that I can actually showcase him is Mike Bloomberg, who is taking part in this conference as well. Mike is a former mayor, and it's very interesting that the global leader of cities and states is a former mayor and not a current mayor or governor, and that tells you something about the lack of leadership. Number 2, there is a lot absurd, pathetic duplication of efforts in terms of membership, in terms of agendas, in terms of targets. I told you, there's 150 international associations or networks that bring together cities and states. Around 50 of them are almost exclusively focused on climate change, or on sustainability, or on environment. So every time I hear about a new initiative, a new association, I go like, oh my God, just a new one. There's no need for a new one. And every 6 months, there's a new one. And I can just list down, every time I write about it, I have to update the previous papers because there's a new association. There's someone that just came up with a new idea of having a new association of subnational governments discussing again climate change without doing the homework, looking back and saying, well, there's another 50 of them, so we don't have to create anything new. In terms of overlapping, let me just give you some numbers. I told you there's overlapping in terms of membership, overlapping in terms of agendas, and there's overlapping in terms of targets as well. It's very, very, very common that a city needs to abide to its own climate change mitigation targets, and then a city needs to comply to the national mitigation targets, and then it needs to comply to the macro region. If you are Cape Town, you have to comply to South Africa, you have to comply with SADC, that brings together the countries in Southern Africa, you have to comply to the African Union, and you have to comply to maybe 20 organizations of subnational governments that Cape Town is a member of. And then at the end, it's a maze. It's very difficult to maneuver in those waters. You need some numbers? Australia. Australia has a national mitigation target of 21 reduction by 2030. That's Australia. Sydney, 80% target. The Convent of Mayors that Sydney is a member of, the target is 40%. Accra, people believe that city targets are more demanding than national targets. That's not true. I'll give you an example. Accra in Ghana. The national target of Ghana is 45% reduction by 2030. The city target of Accra is 53%. Ghana is 45, and the city is 35%. So navigating those waters is very tricky, and if you are a mayor or a governor, you are not really keeping track too much of all these targets. And then when it comes to the very final day, when you have to present your credentials, your performance, that's going to be tricky. Number 3, we have issues with reporting. We are putting forward different targets and different commitments, but how are you going to report that? How are you going to register that? That is tricky. There's an initiative from ICLEI called ICLEI Carbon Climate Registry. There are over 1,000 local governments, which are, they represent around 800 million people. They have reported their own targets, but performance is not adequately measured. And those reports are self-reported. So we need a lot of auditing at the city and national level. And number 4, just to conclude, there is lack of social mobilization. Yes, it's very true that cities and states are pushing the climate change agenda. We saw that in Bonn just a few weeks ago. If you were in Bonn, you would see mayors and governors really embracing, in a very convincing way, the whole climate change agenda. Mike Bloomberg was there, Jeff Brown was there, different mayors and governors were there, and they were really looked at by states, by national states, and cities and other subnational governments are really taking a lead on that. But those targets are not necessarily absorbed by civil society. It seems that individual targets or individual efforts are not necessarily tied up to a collective effort. You know, we all know what are the targets for Massachusetts, for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts on climate change. If I just cross the bridge and if I go to Boston and I talk to anyone there, people would not know what those targets are. And people do not really know what they need to do on an individual basis to tie themselves up to their national or local targets. So for city officials, yes, there is a lot of homework that needs to be done in order to perform well, to accomplish those targets. But yes, there is a lot of low work that cities and governors need to do to make sure that the population absorbs that those targets they have established in different summits.
All right, so Angel, does it add up?
Yeah, thanks so much, Janelle, for that question. And actually, I'm glad I sit next to Rodrigo because you're just teeing up some of the issues that I want to bring up as well. So do all these subnational efforts actually add up to make a significant impact in global climate mitigation? I think, Rodrigo, you pointed to many of the challenges that we're facing right now from the analytic community, which is these divergence of targets. You have nested jurisdictions, and so when a city like Sydney takes a target and then Australia also makes a similar reduction commitment, how do those two align? So this question of overlaps and whether or not these subnational governments are actually delivering additional mitigation efforts that's not already being subsumed or included in national pledges, I think that's a major methodological question that we're now grappling with. So certainly we have to disentangle all these different issues and how to account for when you have these situations of overlap. So that's, I think, a critical question. And so far, the range of studies that have been produced, in some cases, one study will evaluate companies that are taking mitigation actions and evaluating that they can leverage an additional several million tons of CO2 reduced. In other cases, there's one study in Germany that looked at initiatives just within Germany and evaluated 7.5 gigatons by 2030 could additionally be leveraged by these subnational actors. And in the US context, there was a study that was released in September that looked at just 300 companies and also the US Climate Alliance, which includes 13 states and Puerto Rico, for what they could deliver. And that was something in the range of about 50% of what the US had pledged to for the Paris Agreement. And so there's a huge divergence in what scholars and researchers and analysts are producing and coming up with in terms of what subnational efforts can additionally deliver. I would say from our own research, exactly what Stacy mentioned in terms of some of the gaps are absolutely present in the data as well. So we published a study in Nature last year that looked at the non-state actor zone for climate action, NASCO, which is currently an international platform that records 12,000 subnational and non-state efforts from across the world. And some of the gaps that we saw too, predominantly the subnational and non-state efforts that are taking place are in the global north. And so that's a huge problem, right? Because you're not necessarily covering emissions or actions that are going to be responsible for the majority of emissions growth moving forward. And so there are huge gaps in Africa and also Southeast Asia, Latin America, where these current networks are not capturing the diversity of actions that are taking place in the global south. And that's a huge problem because we know that there's a lot of activity that's happening, particularly on the adaptation and the resilience front, that are not being covered because of the issues that Stacey mentioned, of this primarily being a networked and institutionalized movement that's being generated from the global north. And so we need to do more to be able to capture some of these activities that are happening in the global south. Secondly, in terms of sectors, and so a lot of the activity that's happening right now on the business side is happening in areas where we're preaching to the choir. And so it's retail companies, the Global 500, the Forbes 2000 companies who already have very developed corporate social responsibility and climate change strategies. And so when we evaluated the companies that are taking action on NAZCA, we found a huge gap. So only about a fifth of the companies that are responsible for 2/3 of historic emissions are taking actions that are being recorded on NAZCA. So you have huge fossil fuel companies, oil and gas companies, for example, cement, for steel, that are just not taking action on climate change. So we have to do more to fill those gaps as well. So I think I'll just leave those comments there.
Excellent, thank you. So Chris, what can states do, A, to understand their varied agreements, and how do they keep track of those, and then B, to improve standards and improve collaboration on these issues?
So I guess I have to point out that asking about standards and perhaps even regulations, when I come from the state of New Hampshire, our logo, or not logo, but motto is live free or die. So we are naturally a very skeptical people of regulations of all types. And just this past year, we stalled our second-year effort to adopt the most recent building code, which would be the 2015 building code, even though the 2018 code just came out. So kind of that sort of thinking was behind the regional planning that went into the most recent NEGCP Regional Climate Plan, is the recognition that we weren't going to apply the same standard across all of New England, much less all of the NEGCP. And so if you were to go online and get the new climate plan, which is free, and I will get no percentage. Sorry, Rodrigo, I couldn't resist. You'll notice that we're very careful about using words harmonize, coordinate, and collaborate, because we recognize that there's going to be a diffusion of innovation across the region. And while we are ranked 22nd by the ACEEE in New Hampshire, and we've kind of occupied in that 20 area for quite some time, well, most of New England is actually in the top 5. Them moving along and providing that sort of leadership will sweep us along. And will sweep other states, and the provinces can kind of look to that as well. But there's other times when, such as right now, with the Pan-Canadian framework and the Trudeau administration coming in, they're providing leadership on rules, regulations within each of the provinces and across the feds that we can kind of look to. So with the application of the carbon tax, carbon fee performance standard, as we heard about yesterday, there's a lot of interest in what that's going to look like. They, I believe, are due to have all theirs done in 2018, but there's a lot of interest in all of the states in terms of how that might look in each of the different jurisdictions. There's actually one, we have no expectation that it would pass, but there's a bill in front of the New Hampshire legislature to look at carbon taxes. But where the harmonization, coordination, and collaboration is really important is where we look in areas such as grid monitoring, grid modernization, and net metering efforts. There's lots of work that's happening in front of the Public Utilities Commission all across the region right now and across the entire country. I think for grid modernization efforts, there's 30 different movements within the entire United States to look at how we modernize the grid. How do we integrate solar? How do we integrate demand response? How do we integrate storage? But if we do it in a vacuum, which is how it may have been done in the past, we're going to miss efficiencies of learning from each other's pilots. So there's more of an interest in this year and going forward in making sure that we are coordinating with one another and learning from each other. But applying the same standards across the region, I think, is a very challenging thing. Even applying vehicle standards, adopting the California mandate, the ZEB mandate, not all of the states are doing that. Again, New Hampshire, a bit of the donut hole within New England. But we can look to other states to continue to kind of lead there and keep our entire regional emissions down.
Excellent. Okay, and finally, Stacey, can these regional agreements be harmonized for climate adaptation as well?
So it's a good question. And I'll say one thing also to follow up Rodrigo before I talk about adaptation. Look, mayors and state governors, like national leaders and like CEOs and firms and sustainability heads and big companies, right? They set a lot of these goals and they call a lot of these press conferences because they're cheap signals, right? And I think this is really important to remember. I keep saying actually about this that if I'm ever in a garage band again, I might actually call it cheap signal. So one of the reasons, right, that there are 150 of these organizations and that cities may have 17 different pledges to keep track of is because they actually aren't keeping track of all 17 and they don't intend to meet all the goals. I mean, it's a very straightforward sort of political analysis of some of this work, right? So we have to acknowledge it's not just that there are limitations in theory, that's why it's easy to make 12 different commitments because they're not going to keep them all, full stop. And so I think what we do want to see is pay special attention to institutions that actually sort of drive more action. One of the great things about RGGI, which came up a lot yesterday, right? And one of the, as we were discussing, one of the reasons that New Hampshire, even now that its politicians are reluctant to be in, there's money if you stay in, right? So they're staying grudgingly, right? So actually these institutional configurations that yield benefit for progress and moving forward, I think are really important. So I think when we think about adaptation, we have to think about sort of making real progress there. So yes, there is some coordinating effects that need and have to be done. So on the one hand, the building codes, right? Very unsexy building codes. But really, the building codes in the region don't look forward at all. They don't, there's no mandate in project design to think about designing the building for where the sea is likely to be in 2035 or in 2050. There is not much in them that we're supposed to pay any attention to the flood maps. Every time in New England, every time for the last 30 years that you redo flood maps, guess what happens to the 100-year flood map, right? It gets worse. More places are in the 100-year flood map. So if you redo them every 10 years, the 100-year flood map gets worse. That's almost 100% consistent in all the examples I know. And yet, we have a building code that is not responding to that. We have building codes in all the states that are not responding to that. And here in adaptation is a good place with regard to development, again, to note that if we can't figure out how to push those standards forward and forward faster, this is one of those areas that firms and private sector developers can then push states and local governments to compete to keep the standards low. That's what happens. So a huge press at the local level, every place you want to make standards more demanding, is that right across the river there, or right across the border, they don't have to do these standards. So without sort of a greater push for some of these things, I think that's important. The last thing, and I'll pick up something that I thought was far too vague with Secretary Pollack yesterday, is that there's a lot of rhetoric about transportation coordination across the region, but all of the states are way behind on those investments, and the same is true of all the adaptation investments we know that need to be made, right? So I think you have to also say about this that when governors not only stand there and talk about how we're raising the rhetoric about adaptation and resilience, when those come with budget allocations and with real institutional changes and regulatory changes, we'll know that we're making more progress in the region. And again, when you look at what counties of South Florida are doing, what they're doing in California, what actually they're doing in New York City and its regions around these things, they're way ahead of us. And they're way ahead even of Boston and Cambridge on these things. There we can think technical cooperation among the civil servants, how to push the politicians to go farther. The last bit is been involved in a couple of ongoing reports of trying to think about how to finance adaptation. And there are a lot of gee whiz ideas about new kinds of bonds and new kinds of borrowing and all these sorts of things. But really, we got quite a few ideas, a few small scale experiments, but figuring out how to fund adaptation and resilience, how to make it a market the way that carbon has been made into a tradable commodity, a very cheap tradable commodity, by the way, speaking of weaknesses. and this is the direction I think that we need quite a bit more innovation and quite a bit more experimentation, because we don't know how to fund all the work we know needs to be done.
All right, thank you, Stacy. Those are some excellent points. So I'd like to open the discussion up to the audience to broaden the conversation. Yes, do we have mics coming around? We have a question on this side, and I'll make sure to peer across the podium here to see any audience members on that side.
Hi, I'm Bobby Cates Garnick. I'm currently a professor of practice at the Fletcher School at Tufts. And I'd like to just briefly say this and ask a question to each of you. So just briefly, in my own career, I was Undersecretary of Energy. I've been a PUC commissioner. I've worked for a city. I've worked for a utility, and I created an incubator in New York. So I've worked in many sectors. And I think everyone has really identified problems very well, and thank you very much. The issue to me is the stakeholder process. The stakeholder process is so complex, so time-consuming. I wish each of you could I've negotiated with New Hampshire, so I've had that experience from Massachusetts. Can you each give me a solution in the stakeholder process which you think could move this conversation forward? Because in so many ways, that's something that needs to be addressed concurrently with all of your other suggestions.
Great. Maybe what we can do before the panel responds is actually take one or two more questions, and then, yes, this gentleman in the front.
Tim Carter with Second Nature. I was interested in the subnational government versus subnational actor relationship, and if there's a way that there can be some synergistic alignment between not just subnationals from a government perspective where you're goal setting, target setting, but subnational actors, which include businesses, universities, other entities that also share goals but aren't maybe bound to artificial political boundaries, and what sort of opportunities you could explore there.
Okay, great. We'll take one more question. No, we'll start with those two. Please.
Well, no, go ahead.
Thanks for those questions. So on the stakeholder question, this is not a comment on any of the examples you mentioned from your work, but my experience with a lot of stakeholder processes in these areas is that stakeholders get brought in to respond to a decision that someone wants to make. And I think if we start thinking about, particularly in the area of adaptation and resilience, adaptation and resilience investments take place in places, right? They take place where people live, where there are or there are not parks, or there are or are not distributed energy grids, or there are or are not neighborhood or community associations, right? And instead of arriving, as we normally do in public stakeholder processes and in corporate-run stakeholder processes when they're corporate community, in arriving and say, we want to do this. What do you want to do so we can do this, right? Most of those stakeholder processes very often are just negotiation processes. And certainly in savvy communities, everybody knows this. If you show up and want to do a development in Boston, the neighborhood association sits down, they start negotiating. Like, I want a park over there, I want this, I want that, I want this. I want the city to make you give me this much money and do this over here. Because they can't get things otherwise, right? So stakeholder processes that are not negotiation, but are actually community or regionally embedded, in which people are articulating what they want for their communities as part of an ongoing strategy. My UMass Boston colleague Paul Kirschen has been doing work for 8 or 10 years in East Boston around a lot of flood protection, climate change action, community resilience, and development stuff. And here you see now that they have built a set of organizations where citizens feel like they are in a process in which their views matter. It's hard and it takes a long time, but I think that's my first stakeholder reaction. The second thing about the second nature question, just very briefly, one of the reasons we talk so much about these government networks regionally is because the networks between public sector folks are more institutionalized and better than others. This is a city with more globally known universities than maybe any other city on earth, and they're terribly networked with one another. Like, we don't have a well-organized set of adaptation, resilience, and emissions folks. The Harvard and MIT folks are better networked with one another because, as the students always say, it's really one university, just no one told the faculty. But I think actually in terms of where those networks exist, so the last bit there is that if we look to some of the things that happen in clean energy, where you have sometimes grant-funded and sometimes state-supported ways to set up those networks, get those folks together so that they are articulating their views, so that we say, let's organize the green energy economy here in Massachusetts so they can compete on Beacon Hill and other places and get their interests heard. I think we could learn from some of that in the non-governmental side of the networks.
Well, I can relate to both questions. So addressing yours first, I'll give you a concrete example. I was in government 2011, 2010, 2014. Your question was on how to connect the people with the regional government on climate change. Governments have at least two ways of going about that issue. Number one is they could just on their own draft a climate change policy, and that's it, have it approved on Senate, on local council, so on and so forth. Option number two is, in a very politically correct way, they'll draft the policy and then they'll just let key stakeholders know about that policy to have it endorsed somehow, and then they have it voted. We tried to do something else in São Paulo, and it's quite funny that I'm not Brazilian. I was not born in Brazil. I don't have a Brazilian nationality. I don't have a Brazilian passport, but I was having that position, which tells you a lot about how experimental and new and innovative cities and states can be also at that very level. So what I did together with the 120 people that were making up the Foreign Affairs Department of the State Government of São Paulo was telling the governor that would do something radically different. And the radically component of the São Paulo Climate Change Mitigation Policy 2020 was basically going and talking to the different stakeholders and telling them that we do not have a policy. So the governor did not have a policy, wished not to have a policy without incorporating the wills and the interests of the different stakeholders. So we didn't have an agenda. So we talked to the different business leaders, business associations, student universities, community associations, just to listen to them. And the funny thing was that when we reached out to them, they had no idea what climate change was all about. Targets, Kyoto, they had no idea. So even before engaging in a conversation with them, in order to collect data, in order to later on to be included in the state policy, we had to educate them. So it was Minister of Environment / Minister of Foreign Affairs initiative at the very beginning, and then we brought in the Minister of Education, for example, so that the public school teachers could educate their students on climate change, for example. We had to go on tens and dozens of meetings with business leaders to make sure that they were aware of global policies on climate change. So instead of taking 6 months to have a climate change policy, it took us 2 years. But then at the end, when the governor went to Rio Plus 20 and present the climate change policy, it was truly a state collective, inclusive effort. We just put the last rubber stamp. We didn't initiate it, we just concluded. On stakeholders and leadership, I mentioned there is some neglect, poor governors, poor performance in terms of leadership. Yesterday I wrote an article for the World Economic Forum on comparing President Trump, not President Trump, sorry. In 1947, I was comparing the United States where they were right now and where California is right now. I was comparing the United States coming out from the Second World War and entertaining the idea, and then later on implementing and executing the idea and embracing the idea of being a global power, and where California is right now in 2017. The article basically said that California is the 6th largest economy. They play around with the idea of being a global power on climate change and trade issues. They have not been able to deliver yet. And I presented a set of different arguments demonstrating that Governor Brown is fully equipped to be a global leader on climate change, but he has not been able to fulfill that role. I'll give you a very small example. We have 40 states running 250 trade/tourism/environment offices abroad. 250. California has one, which is paid by someone else, by a business association, the Bay Area Council. Missouri has 15 offices. Pennsylvania has 15. Florida has 13 offices. California has one. The state budget for foreign affairs and climate change is very, very low. The California state budget is $183 billion. For foreign affairs, it's just a couple of $1 million to pay 10 or 15 people that work with foreign affairs at the state level. 10 or 15 people. If you go to Bavaria in Germany, there's 250 people. If you go to the state of São Paulo, I was running a 120 people team. If you go to Jiangsu or Guangdong in China, there's 400 people doing foreign affairs. It's state departments at the local level. California has 10 or 15. Los Angeles. I was with Mayor Garcetti just 2 or 3 weeks ago in LA in an event. We were discussing the International Trade Department, as he calls it. And then he invited to visit the International Trade Department at the mayor's office. The International Trade Department of the city of LA is one person. So there's no department, there's one person. There's a deputy mayor of international affairs in the city of LA, but her department is 3 people. So California is severely understaffed. There is a major need for that space to be fulfilled with strong leadership. Jerry Brown could be today, or California could be in 2018, where the United States were in 1947, 1948. And the article is going viral. I got 4 phone calls from California since I sat on this chair. So there is something going on that we have to take advantage of. And I truly recommend everyone to address this issue of lack of leadership at the subnational level on climate change.
Any other questions from the audience? No. Yes, the gentleman on the side.
Eric Theroux, Government of Quebec. It was a bit depressing in terms of for a subnational government representative to basically seeing a conversation in which it's just like we don't have any effectivity. Although I share quite a few comments, but I wonder why, for example, when at Bonn conference, when the Chinese government organized a China Carbon Market Day, they invited Governor Brown, the Minister of Quebec, a representative from the World Bank and the EC commissioners, but no other state. So basically, at subnational level, we should do something that is quite effective in this regard if China is invited us. And it's true that as a civil servant, we have to be fully engaged in order to deliver what our politicians are committed to. And it's a lot of work. Quebec is doing quite a job in this regard with its 500 people at the Ministry of International Relations and 26 representations abroad. So yes, as far as Quebec is concerned, we are really committed, especially in the issue on climate change. So basically my point was, can I have your views on the effectivity, the real effectivity at state national level, considering the fact that the last point is that we nevertheless succeeded to have a specific reference in the Paris Accord on the specific role of all levels of governments. So yes, at some national and cities level, And there will be the global summit in Paris next week. The French asked also to have a representative from the Quebec government because they have special interest on the role of subnational levels. So that was my point and question.
Thank you. Okay, so question on the effectiveness. Yeah, Chris?
So I guess it depends on what scale. Are you talking about effectiveness of leadership or effectiveness in terms of performance of greenhouse gas emission reductions and policy? And I guess, continuing to reflect on just the NEGCP, say that it's been highly successful. Our emissions, we set the benchmark at 1990, but our emissions peaked in the 2000s and shortly after the 2001 action plan was implemented. And we have dropped back down. Our goal was to achieve 1990 levels by 2010, which we met, and then to have a 10% reduction below 1990 by 2020, which as of 2013 and 2014, those are the most recent years that emissions inventory is available due to delays in the data generation at the federal levels, we were already at that 2020 target. And some of that can be pointed towards changes in the economy, and the switch from coal to natural gas. But we've seen that there's been changes in kind of the way that we vehicle utilization, as well as the impact of the regional greenhouse gas initiative. So but what we're also seeing is if we look back to that original plan and I guess what we would call its children, the 11 climate action plans that were each implemented or developed for each of the states and provinces, those then had impacts within each of the state and provincial legislatures. Just speaking with the states, you can actually track individual pieces of legislation, even within New Hampshire, where we've been a little bit more skeptical of climate change. We had our plan come out in 2009, and there was a large number of bills that followed in the years later. But what happened in 2001, it takes a while for things to get rolling and get in place. And I think that's where we find ourselves now because of the work that was laid down 15 years ago. We're now at the point where we're beginning to transform. And we're it's not just technology, but there was a lag time because we're changing the infrastructure of the entire region. It's a big ship. It takes a long time to turn around. There's a reason why the Titanic sank. You can't stop it when it's going towards an iceberg. In this case, we started in 2001 and we're starting to reap the benefits now. So I definitely feel that from a performance standpoint, when we're just looking at the data, we are seeing that we're going down. But we're also looking out to 2030. Are we going to hit where we need to be in 2030 to keep on that path to 2050? In 2013, the answer was no. And that's why we set a new target, looked at all of the individual targets that we had for the 11 jurisdictions, and recognized that if we hit every single one of the individual 11 jurisdictional targets, the ones that grew out of that 2001 plan, we would stay on that pathway. But we reaffirmed it in 2015 as having a regional target, noting that not everyone's going to be in the same spot. Newfoundland and Labrador, they have different challenges than New Hampshire. They reflected on those yesterday. Massachusetts has a little bit more of a progressive government, so that they're going to continue to lead and be number one. But in all working together, we're going to kind of keep moving and turning that ship. But it's going to take time. But the leadership that we exhibited in 2001 and then reaffirmed in 2015 and then just passed in August, people look at that and they begin to model it. Within days after we had set the 35 to 45% reduction below 2030, I was hearing that they were beginning to incorporate that into the modeling for the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. There was no statutory requirement that we met that. It's completely voluntary, and if you read any of the things that we put out about it, we note that no jurisdiction is committed to that, that we are just agreed that we are going to work towards that collaboratively, but symbols matter, and I think that's where people begin to notice. And policies begin to change, policymakers look to this. But kind of going back to where stakeholders stand, it's people reading that plan, which is free, and which I do not receive a percentage of. People looking at that and kind of following up with governments and making sure, holding our feet to the fire, because governments do change, but non-governmental actors, they stick around. And they can kind of keep the civil servants thinking about this. And if they're finding that one jurisdiction isn't, go work in another jurisdiction because maybe they'll lead and we will follow. In those jurisdictions where we have a harder time keeping up.
Yeah, Actually, I just wanted to touch on the previous question about solutions, and Chris, the comments that you made, because I think exactly one of the solutions that we need to be working towards with respect to these various regional and subnational networks is streamlining of reporting and information. With the proliferation, as Rodrigo mentioned, of these 150 networks, I mean, it's impossible to keep track of. And so, I mean, if there was this portal or I guess a TurboTax that cities and regional and subnational governments could go into and fill out just basic information, as you said, on baselines, on targets, on different actions for implementing and reaching those targets, I mean, I think that's what's really needed so that non-party and civil society stakeholders can then be that watchdog, as you suggested, and actually read the data for free and not have to, buy a book, and hold leaders accountable to those targets and to those goals. But I would say that one good news coming, or at the international level, is that there is some of this consolidation that is happening. So, for example, you mentioned the Covenant of Mayors, Rodrigo. They've recently joined with the European Covenant of Mayors to join a global Covenant of Mayors, which Mike Bloomberg serves as one of the key board members for. And also the Carbon Disclosure Project, or CDP, they're now working with individual company networks and also these city networks to collect data and consolidate in one centralized platform, recognizing that it is a huge ask of civil servants to continuously provide these data and reports for all these various networks and to report on all these different targets and commitments that mayors are making. And so there is some, I think, consolidation that is happening, but I think much more needs to occur.
Just very quickly, our colleague from Quebec is exactly right, that there's great accomplishments among a number of the subnational leaders. My concern, and in fact I have the experience a lot where I think I'm being optimistic and people tell me I'm being depressing. But I think my concern is not that Quebec and California aren't doing amazing work and many of the other leaders. It's that what's happening mostly is that the other leaders are following each other. So who are the followers of these leaders? We use leaders like, the word suggests there are followers, right? But actually what mostly is happening is that the leaders are following each other and learning from each other really well. And that part of the kind of policy experimentation and engendering advancing is going great. But what's not happening is, and Quebec and California are great examples, right? Because we know actually that Quebec and Ontario's accomplishments are pretty substantial, but Canadian emissions are a disaster, right? And the same is true of some of the leaders in this country compared to the national trajectories of the national trends. And so that's the part I think that in terms of going forward, we have to figure out, that's the nut we haven't cracked yet. The leaders are doing amazing stuff.
We have a follow-up question on here.
So I'm Tom Malone. I'm a professor at MIT and director of the Center for Collective Intelligence here, and also the founder of a project called Climate Collab. I want to go back to the previous set of questions about stakeholder engagement. One of the things we're exploring in the Climate Collab project is how to use new information technologies to create online networks to do a much more extensive version of engaging stakeholders, far more than you can do in a few face-to-face meetings like this, but doing it in a deep online network. So this is a question primarily for Angela, because I know she knows something about what we're doing in that project, but the more general question for any of you is what opportunities, what potentials, what guidelines would you suggest for how to use online technologies to do much more extensive stakeholder engagement?
Yeah, so thanks so much, Thomas, for that question. And I'm familiar with the Climate Collab, so I'm really glad that you brought that as a solution, because I think it absolutely represents potential to engage crowdsourcing to help fill in a lot of these knowledge and information gaps. And so, I mean, I would say that that's the number one potential and possibility, is to gap fill. So to utilize the power of the crowd in order to fill in a lot of the missing information that we have in terms of, in the global south, what are these different actors doing on climate change adaptation, on resilience, to address vulnerability to climate change, what are they doing on the mitigation space? So going back to that study that I mentioned that we published, we found that overwhelmingly about 85% of subnational commitments are focused on climate change mitigation. And I think that's, again, reflective of what the global north is doing. But there are a lot of these other qualitative capacity building, for example, activities that are taking place that the current metrics are not designed to capture. And so I think using a crowdsourcing platform like Climate Collab, we might be able to capture the diversity, the whole range of climate change actions that are currently not being captured, because we know in the literature and in the scholarship that these are very important activities that can catalyze future mitigation in the future, but the networks and the current data platforms currently are not capturing. So that I would say that, yeah, the Climate Collab absolutely needs to be engaged in this conversation.
I think the other thing that such things could help us make a little progress on is that we tend to keep the climate and energy conversations and policies confined to climate and energy. But when you expand the stakeholder participations, when you leave open what people actually want for their communities, and then it's incumbent on those of us who think about climate and energy all the time to figure out how to connect climate and energy to what they want, like a safe place for their kids to play basketball, or a park, or something, or some sort of community organizational capacity, so that actually there is some support for neighborhood level community organizations. That's the thing. I think also there's a lot of potential in getting us out of our environment and energy silo and out to what most normal people think about every day, and that's not like the changing climate, right? And so.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think that's how you get buy-in for climate action, to actually implement city, region, and national climate plans. I mean, when we talk about Pakala and Sokolo's wedges, these technology wedges to help us achieve global climate goals, I think the one most mysterious wedge is the behavioral wedge. So you have these top-down technological solutions, but then how do you actually encourage the bottom-up piece, behavior change, getting people to adopt certain technologies, getting them to buy into car sharing, for example, or ZEVs or low electric vehicles. It's actually, that's the key part. You have to mobilize the bottom-up action. And so I think having this Climate Collab platform to engage stakeholders, to get them to communicate what it is they care about. I think that could be the missing link.
So I think we're almost out of time, so we could take one final question, and then each of the panelists can have a final remark. Yes, the gentleman in the, was there somebody else? I'm sorry.
Who's been waiting longer?
Who has been waiting?
All right. Actually, it might be good that I took this spot, because I have to ask a question that's really looking at everything the other way around. I'm Mike Tamor from Ford. I'm one of the very few people who's sort of on the receiving end of the regulatory effort. And I actually found this whole discussion extremely disturbing. We have an expert who's making a career out of keeping track of the thousands of entities that are appointing themselves as promoters and regulators of climate and energy action. We heard about all these different, sub-state level actors who are setting their own climate targets and their own metrics and their own methodologies for achieving them. And if you think about that from the side of the people who actually have to sort of do business in that environment, that's a recipe for complete paralysis. Okay, so when I hear different entities setting different climate goals, why are their goals different? Do they perceive the problem differently, which is a problem? Do they, or are they setting their goals based on what they think they can do, which is also a problem? So it seems like the discussion should really be around how to, as a first step, harmonize the targets so that every actor is working to the same target, and then try to reduce the number of entities so that we can start moving toward a single set of metrics. Because like utilities complain that they're unable to change their business because they're regulated typically by an average of 6 regulatory bodies, if I remember correctly, and there might be utility people here who can correct that. Automakers in the US alone have to deal with 3 conflicting fuel economy and emission standards, and even that's a recipe for paralysis. And then you're talking about everybody and their cousin putting together overlapping groups. So is there a way to kind of unwind this, harmonize and simplify? Because I just see this as a recipe. The reason why these new ones keep appearing is that the old ones aren't doing anything, and the old ones aren't doing anything because there were already too many. So I'm just looking for sort of a reaction to my reaction.
Excellent, thank you. So in 1 minute or less, we'll have the panelists simplify the problem and make it more effective. Rodrigo?
former New York Mayor LaGuardia used to say there is no Democratic or Republican way, different way of fixing a sewer. So there is a very natural problem-solving attitude when it comes to cities and states. I just think the next step is having that same attitude applying to the apparatus cities and states they have created. And the next step for that is fixing the leadership issue. Again, you have some cities and states that are natural leaders. Quebec is one of them. It's an example that I know very well. Went to Quebec maybe 5 times over the last 5 years, talking to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, let's call it that way, of Quebec. New York is a potential leader, Beijing another one, Anne Hidalgo in Paris. So we have a constellation of potential leaders, but that their leadership is temporary and it's diffuse in a way, and it's not acknowledged universally. So once we fix the leadership problem, and we can fix that problem in a Republican way or in a Democratic way, we just need to address that issue as soon as possible.
So I completely agree with you. I think it's a huge mess. But one piece of good news is that there is a movement from the research and academic community to develop guidance for companies and cities to adopt science-based targets and goal setting. And so looking at the IPCC scenarios and what action is needed to actually give guidance to companies on how to align their particular corporate targets with these goals. So that is happening. But I would say part of the problem is also political. And so I think in the course of the discussion, we've discussed how political target setting is and goal setting and also participation in these various networks are. So in some of my conversations with the Under 2 Coalition, which is a collaboration of primarily state and regional governments, so I'm going to leave these Canadian provinces completely anonymous, but through this network, there was an anecdote shared with me that one Canadian province set one emissions target, and then the other Canadian province said, oh, we're going to increase our target by 1% just so we can look better than this other Canadian province. And so I think this type of competition, even though it is a similar race to the top, it is problematic because these targets are being set without regard to what the science says needs to happen. And so, I mean, I think it is a responsibility for leaders within these networks to adopt these scientific guidelines to help encourage members to actually set targets and goals that are grounded in science and that can help us get to where we need to go.
And we recognize that in what we put into this year's NEGCP plan, like that looking across the region, there are opportunities to do that. But I definitely see it as a top-down, bottom-up issue. I believe when the auto standards, the federal U.S. Vehicle standards came out a few years ago, the first time, it was in response to the fact that California had one set of regulations, and so the Obama administration worked with the auto manufacturers to kind of create a nationwide standard rather than have a patchwork. And so having, I think right now what we're seeing is a lot of these goals, regulations, we're seeing it even in the state level because they're popping up because there's an absence of leadership and clarity. So the groups are trying to kind of push their own agenda, but I think the manufacturers and the regulated community have a role to kind of keep communicating that harmony at the leadership at the top will kind of prevent some of these groups from feeling they need to push as hard. And so that's why they're doing it. We're seeing towns in New Hampshire adopt the building standard because the state hasn't. And so they're doing it as a signal, but they're also doing it because they feel that their residents deserve that 30% energy efficiency boost that you get when you build to the new standard, but the state hasn't set yet.
So I'll just add one quick thing, which is that the story you told about messy multi-government standards is right, except for you left out the private sector's role in producing this outcome, right? The reason the private sector actors and activists and NGO ones venue shop for the most progress they can make. The reason environmentalists, mostly in this country, hear harmonizing standards as a nightmare is because they lose. When we go to harmonize at the national level. That's why, so in your example of utility regulators, if more of the utility industry wanted a real high standard that recognizes the climate world, we might get a little bit closer. But in fact, the utilities are very divided, right, in Washington about what they want. And so one of the reasons that this is a mess and that political leadership is hard is precisely because the private sector actors have also participated in this system. The reason that towns can raise their building codes is because the Real Estate Association and the Chamber of Commerce are way stronger in Concord than they are in Durham, where the University of New Hampshire is, right? And so that is part of that's part of the mess, the production of the mess.
All right.
Actually, Durham has the leading building code in New Hampshire.
Of course. Of course. Where are you in
We are out of time, but thank you very much to a highly informed panel.